Good afternoon, everyone. Quake Weather here with an update on the forecast we had a few days ago, CME impacts, and the California watch period. Right now, you're looking at the sun in 211 angstroms. We indeed have another coronal hole that's center disk and facing Earth, the effects of which we should be getting anytime between tonight and 2 to 3 days from now. It is an extension of the southern solar polar field, which is of positive magnetic complexity. And we're going to look at low pressure cells. This is a very large low pressure cells that's near where we had that big earthquake in Russia, which we'll go over in a second. There's also low pressure cell activity we should be keeping an eye on over here just north of the Philippines. And down here, maybe in southern Australia, although we don't see too many large earthquakes down there, so I wouldn't put that on too big of a watch period. Southern California into Nevada and over here in Baja, Mexico, still on, I'd put at a medium risk for higher seismic activity. We'll go over that in a second as well. And then the west coast of South America, up here in this region up here, and then down here in the Peru, Chile, Argentina area as well. If we go over here to Europe, possibly Italy, and this area right here is all one big low pressure cell, so it's kind of hard to nail down, but we can go over that in a second as well. The daily OLR anomaly data that we have is from yesterday, so not 2 days old, which isn't too bad. And you can see there's an area right up here in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, West Coast. Over here, still in that area, just off the east coast of Russia, where they had that 7-pointer. And down here, just north of the Philippines. And then, of course, the usual suspects down here in Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu, and maybe even slightly Indonesia, but not too big of a risk, I wouldn't say. So when we were talking about the impacts from CMEs in our last video, we were discussing how it's difficult to determine whether or not a CME that is Earth directed and going to affect Earth will actually trigger larger events as far as earthquakes and volcanoes. The reason why it's hard to do that is because we don't have any satellites or any ways to observe where the energy transfer takes place from all the extra charged particles and stuff that we're getting from unmitigated solar wind in those coronal holes. If the energy transfer takes place up in the atmosphere, then it kind of shields us from larger earthquakes. However, if they penetrate the atmosphere and go down to the surface or the lithosphere, we will see a triggering of large earthquakes. And that seems to be what happened here. If you look at the times these happened and you correlate this data with the planetary KP index and when we got geomagnetic storms, you'll see some time correlations there. So we got this big 7-pointer up here in Russia, and that's right near where we showed you that low pressure cell over here. See, here's that really large low pressure cell. That's where it is now. It could have been over here. I wasn't paying attention at the time, but it's likely this somewhat affected it. We got all that unmitigated solar wind and charged particles coming from the sun. They fed into one of these high pressure cells, which fed into the low pressure cell, and it caused an earthquake right here. So if we zoom out a little bit, that's just to add to the CME impact thing. Sometimes CMEs will trigger quakes, and I believe this is what happened here. The coronal hole forces that we were expecting to trigger earthquakes had likely already passed and gone by the time we got the 7.0. However, this does correlate on a timeline much more closely with the CME impact itself. So in this case, I would say the CME is what triggered this large earthquake, as opposed to giving us sort of a magnetic shield buffer from those charged particles coming to the surface. Moving on to California. So if we switch this here to 1 day, all magnitudes, why not? We're seeing a large cluster over here in Bakersfield, up here in the Grapevine area. If we just zoom in on just this area right here, we're looking at, just in this area, 10 earthquakes, 4 of which were above 2.0. These are very small, but the fact that they're occurring in such a small cluster of time, this is just in a 24-hour period, mind you. If we go to 7 day, I'm sure it'll be much, much higher. See, that's ridiculous. This is 110 up here, if you could see. So that's 1,983 worldwide, but just in this area that we're looking at right here, we're looking at just north of 100 small events in the past week. So that is somewhat concerning. However, there's another thing aside from the fault lines that we have branching out in this general area, because we are in Southern California. I live in Los Angeles, which is, an hour and a half or so, 2 hours south of Bakersfield. So I'm not too familiar with the area, but from what I understand, there are a bunch of oil fields out here. If you look in this area, all these little events are occurring all everywhere. They don't seem to be really pinpointed in an area where you would expect to see oil fields. A lot of this, like these green squares, this is large fields. There's a lot of farms out there. So likely from a fault line. Not really sure that there's too many oil fields out there, but if anybody out there, you live in Bakersfield and you're more familiar with the area, if you want to leave me some comments and let me know, I would appreciate that, because I'm not familiar with this area as you may be. So if we zoom out a little bit, there's that Highland Park quake. Let's just go to 1 day, all magnitude again. We are seeing a little bit of activity right here. Also something we want to keep an eye on. These are very small earthquakes. One pointers, we almost never look at these, but when we're looking at California, particularly me, this is the only area of the planet that I look at this closely where I go below even 4-point magnitude for most places, because I want it, like as I had mentioned before, California, the whole US West Coast is a lot more difficult to forecast accurately, as the subduction zone is a lot shallower. So it removes the process we had of identifying blot echoes, which are essentially really deep earthquakes that occur in the subduction zone itself. And because it's really shallow here in California, it's hard to say whether or not these are deeper and moving upward in a certain area. And also, a lot of the times when we get precursors to larger quakes in California and the US West Coast, I think in general, those precursors are pretty small relative to the rest of the world. So if we look at other major earthquakes around the world, like anything that's, when we talk about major earthquakes, we talk about 6 magnitude or higher. In some cases, maybe even like really big earthquakes, we would say 7 magnitude, but 5 magnitude is not really statistically relevant as far as forecasting accurately a major event, because those happen too often. So when we say major earthquakes, we're talking about 6 magnitude or higher. So in other parts of the world, you'll typically see, when you see precursors to large earthquakes, you'll see 4 magnitude. You'll see a lot of these, and you'll see them really deep too, 100 kilometers or deeper. 56 isn't really too deep, but if you come down a little bit, there's some that are really deep, especially in Fiji, like this whole area right here, the southwestern Pacific Ocean. You get some really deep ones, 500, 600 kilometers, 400 kilometers. And even over here in South America, you get really deep ones so if we get in a 3 to 5 day period, if you get 3 or more, I would say, just generally speaking, about an estimate, 3 or more earthquakes that are 4 magnitude or higher and at a depth of 100 kilometers or more, that is an indication that that could be a precursor to a much larger event that's 6 magnitude or higher. However, going back to California, we don't really see that too much. If we go back to the Searles Valley earthquake that we reviewed in our last live stream, there was a big cluster, a lot of small earthquakes occurring up into that big one. And most, if not all of them, did not reach 4 magnitude. So it would have escaped the procedure that we have here at Quake Weather of determining whether or not these are precursors, because they were below 4.0 magnitude. So that's why only in California, just in the US West Coast in general, if I'm seeing a lot of things in the satellite data which could indicate that there could be a large earthquake, and we're seeing some events that are a little more frequent than usual or larger than usual, which we have been seeing, I'll try to look more closer and try to get a better feel of what's going on. So Bakersfield getting a ton of stuff, right? I would definitely keep my eyes on there more than anything, but we do see some things acting up down here. And so these are very small. I wouldn't put too much stock in those. You probably want to look more over to the Inland Empire area, Puente Hills, that kind of general region has been of concern, especially in recent years. And this is what we're seeing here. Again, really small. So I'm still leaning towards we're not going to see a major event. However, due to the complexity of CME impacts and the fact that we have another coronal hole from the southern solar polar field that's going to be affecting Earth over the next couple days, coming on the heels of those CMEs, it's kind of tough. I don't have a lot of confidence either way, but at this point in time, I am leaning towards not likely to see a major event at 6 magnitude or higher. However, I definitely still put us at risk, medium risk to say the least. And again, it's really hard to determine these things because the first CME impacts we had didn't seem to affect Earth as far as earthquakes, but the last two that I believe, and definitely that last one that gave us that 7.0 on the east coast of Russia, did play a role in triggering a larger event. So I would keep an eye on this area. If you start seeing things act up here on USGS, the earthquake maps, you start seeing more clusters of events. If you start seeing events that go above 3.0, I would say I would keep an eye on those areas. And especially if they start happening in, groups within a 24-hour to a 72-hour period, I would keep an eye on it. So between now and about Wednesday, I would still put us at medium risk for a large event here in Southern California. And possibly even the U.S. West Coast, because as we've mentioned, if I can go back to the daily outgoing long wave radiation anomalies, we have this area up here, this dark area up here. That's right over the Cascadia fault zone. And again, this is data from yesterday, so this could be bigger. It could be totally gone by now. That's one of the disappointing things with the tools that we have at our disposal, is that some of the data, particularly with the outgoing long wave radiation anomalies, the data up here you see is usually at least a day old, if not 2 or 3 days old. It's not really up to date, unfortunately, because this is actually a very key data point to determine location of where larger events are expected to occur. We got the time windows down pretty well. Very, very accurate with time windows as far as major events. Definitely in the high 90 percentile, I would say 95% or higher, at least. Location is a lot trickier when it comes to these things, especially when you're narrowing down such a time window like we do here at Quake Weather. So unfortunately, this tool isn't as up to date as we'd like it to be, because this would actually be very helpful if this got updated every hour or so, because it would give us a much clearer picture of what's going on, how things transpired, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's about it for today. Again, it's August 18th. That's your forecast for now. Quake Weather out.